What's up, house groups? We are in week 3, the Winning in the Wilderness series, talking about Daniel chapter 3, which is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego standing out because they refused to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's idol and then getting thrown into a fiery furnace. And as I was reading it this week and thinking about suffering for standing out, it reminded me of college and one of my favorite professors, Dr. Archer. He was a phenomenal history lecturer, but he also had this habit of asking questions that he hadn't given us the answer to, hadn't lectured on. He'd just ask ridiculous hard questions and then humiliate whatever student was dumb enough to make eye contact with him and then get the wrong answer. And I had a buddy who took a class with me once, and I told him, man, just whenever he asks a question, don't make eye contact. Look down and do not let him see you, because if he calls on you, you're going to get the answer wrong, and he's going to make you feel like an idiot. And sure enough, first day, he didn't take my advice, and Dr. Archer was talking about how much poop was in the rivers in Paris, because in the Middle Ages, they just dumped all the people poop and cow poop in the rivers, so they couldn't drink the water. And he said, what do you think people drank back then? And called on my buddy Eric, because Eric made eye contact after I told him not to, and he froze and looked at him and said, milk? And Dr. Archer just started cackling. He goes, yes, they kept cows in the hallways of their apartment buildings, Eric. They just went out and milked the cow in the common entryway. And we're walking back from class. He's like, you told me not to make eye contact, and I should have listened, and I accidentally did it wrong. And Dr. Archer gave him a hard time, and that's kind of how it went in that class. And it's part of the reason I loved him. But anyways, sometimes in life, when you don't blend in, then you suffer significant consequences. We live in a world that constantly invites us to just do what everyone else is doing. Because if we do what everyone else is doing, then everyone else around us feels better about themselves. And if we refuse to compromise our faith or our integrity or our convictions, if we don't do what everyone else does, then they don't feel as good about themselves because they realize we're living differently. And so every single day, every single moment of our lives as we live in 21st century of America, we're always going to be invited to compromise and just blend in. I don't know who said it, but there's this famous quote that says, the only thing worse than being ignored is not being ignored. And it's so true. None of us want to be ignored, but then we get in situations and in crowds, whether it's at school or work or family gatherings, wherever we're at, and sometimes we just want to blend in because we don't want to face the consequences. We don't want to face the furnace that has to be faced when we stand out. But I think the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shows us, number one, who God is when we face the furnace for standing up for what we believe in and standing out for doing what's right in the face of a world that refuses to do that. And it also shows us what sort of change we can affect on the world. It's hard to stand out, but when we do, it changes the world. It shifts the narrative for everybody around us. On June 5th, 1989, the Chinese government put down a whole bunch of riots in Tiananmen Square. There were a bunch of students who were just protesting the oppressive communist regime, and the communist government sent in tanks and soldiers and killed 6,000 students in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And the next day, this row of tanks that had taken out all these students was making their way down a street toward more protests, and a man walked in front of the line of tanks with a bag in his hand, and he just stood there. And he wouldn't let the tanks go around him. He literally stopped this entire column of tanks, and he stood firm, and he gave him the option of either, stopping or running him over. Those were the only two things that they could do. And there was an American photographer who was in Beijing at the time, and he just snapped this picture, and it was named the most iconic photograph of the 20th century. And he was later apprehended and dragged off, and he was probably murdered, probably killed by the Chinese government. But Tank Man and the picture of him standing there in defiance of a murderous regime changed the narrative around Tiananmen Square. And it charted sort of a new course forward for the protests, because this one man who probably got killed for doing it, had the courage to stand and refuse to blend in. He changed the world. And the same thing happens for us. Again, our world's always going to invite us to blend in and just do what everyone else is doing. And it's always going to threaten us with the furnace and threaten us with consequences if we live with integrity and we live with faith and we live with hope in a world that has very little of any of those things. We're going to be threatened with consequences just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were. But the crazy thing about their story that still rings true today is that we have a God who steps in and walks with us in the furnace. And so if we're willing to stand up for what's right, to change the world by being the people he called us to be, instead of assimilating, then our God steps in and our God walks with us through our pain and through our suffering and through our difficulty. Like life is hard. You know, whether it's for standing up and standing out or just because it's 2021 and the world is a difficult place, every single one of us tonight is going to leave house groups and head back out into a world where life is really, really difficult. But what I want all of us to know, just to know that we know this week, is just like Jesus showed up and walked in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Whatever the furnace is that you're facing right now, you can face the furnace because God walks with you in the flames. That is so cool that we have the God, the only God who walks with us through the furnaces of life.